No child was ever meant to survive in this world. In a time ruled by cruel and merciless gods, every newborn faced the same horrifying fate. The moment they were born, they were taken, not by strangers, not by enemies, but by their own father, a god, so consumed by fear that he chose power over blood. His name was Cronus, a ruler feared by gods and titans alike. But even he could not escape destiny. A prophecy haunted him, a vision of the future where his own son would rise and destroy everything he had built. And so, he made a choice, a dark and irreversible choice. Driven by fear, he took control of fate itself. One by one, his children disappeared, erased from the world, before they even had a chance to live. But fate cannot be controlled forever. And one day, something changed. A single moment, a single decision that would challenge the will of a god. A mother, desperate and terrified, refused to let her child suffer the same fate. She knew the risk, she knew the consequences. But for the first time in history, a god would be deceived. She placed a stone in his hands and watched as he accepted the lie, believing he had won again. But the real child was already far away, hidden from the eyes of gods, protected by silence and darkness. That child was Zeus, the one who was never supposed to live. And one day, he would return, not as a child, but as something far more dangerous. A god who would not just take power, but reshape the world itself. Far from the world of gods, he grew in silence, hidden from destiny, protected from the eyes of those who feared him most. No one knew he existed, no one except fate itself. But power cannot stay hidden forever. Even as a child, something about him was different. The air would change, the sky would respond, as if the world itself recognized who he truly was. He did not understand it yet, but something ancient lived inside him, something powerful, something dangerous. And then, one day, the truth found him. Not a story, not a myth, but the reality of who his father was and what he had done. In that moment, everything changed. The silence inside him turned into something else. Not fear, not doubt, but something far more dangerous. Purpose. He was no longer just surviving, he was preparing. Because deep down, he knew the truth. This world was never meant to be ruled by fear. And if no one else could change it, then he would. But even a god cannot start a war alone. Power means nothing without those who are willing to stand beside you. And so, he began to search, not for followers, but for those who had suffered, just like him, hidden in darkness, forgotten by the gods. There were others, beings, waiting for a chance to rise again. They had been imprisoned, buried deep within the earth, erased from the world by fear. But Zeus saw something different, not monsters, but power. And so, he made a choice, a dangerous one. He set them free, and in return, they gave him something no god had ever possessed before, a weapon forged not from metal, but from the sky itself, the power of lightning, the power to challenge a titan. But even a god cannot start a war alone. Power means nothing without those willing to fight beside you. And so, he began to search, not for followers, but for warriors hidden in darkness. There were beings waiting. They had been imprisoned, buried deep beneath the world. But Zeus didn't see prisoners. He saw power. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He broke their chains, and the world, felt it. In return, they gave him something no god had ever held before, a weapon born from the sky itself, lightning. The sky changed first. Dark clouds swallowed the light, as if the world itself knew something was about to begin. Then came the silence, the kind that only exists before destruction. And then it began. Zeus didn't wait. He struck first. The world trembled as gods and titans finally collided. This wasn't a fight. It was a war that would reshape everything. Every strike shattered the earth itself. Every moment pushed the world closer to collapse. And in the middle of it all stood Zeus. Not as a child, not as a survivor, but as something far more dangerous. And then, through the storm, he appeared, not as a shadow, not as a memory, but as the one who ruled everything before him. The sky itself seemed to hesitate as Cronus stepped forward, ready to face the sun he was never supposed to see again. For a moment, everything stopped. No movement, no sound, just two forces, standing at the edge of something that would decide the fate of the world. This wasn't just a battle. This was destiny, colliding with itself, a sun standing against the force that once controlled his entire existence. And then, without warning, the world broke. The first strike was not just powerful, it was unstoppable. It tore through the sky, as if the heavens themselves had turned against their creator. But Cronus did not fall. He stood, unshaken, like a force that had never been meant to break. He answered, with a force that shook reality itself, a power so overwhelming, it felt like the end of everything. The ground collapsed, the sky tore open, and the war reached its peak. But Zeus did not step back. He stepped forward. Because this was never about survival. This was about ending what should have never ruled in the first place. The storm did not calm. It grew stronger, as if the sky itself had chosen a side. Lightning began to fall faster, louder, closer, and in the middle of it all, Zeus stood unmoving, as if he had become the storm itself. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of what he was about to become. This was no longer a fight. This was transformation. Across from him, Cronus watched, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. Because in that moment, he realized the truth. The prophecy was no longer a possibility. It had already begun. And then, the final clash began. Not fast, not chaotic, but precise, like two forces that had always been moving toward this exact moment. The impact was beyond anything the world had ever seen. The sky cracked open, and the earth answered. Mountains collapsed, oceans trembled, and the air itself felt like it was breaking apart. But this time, something was different. For the first time, the Titan stepped back, not defeated, not broken, but no longer in control. And in that moment, everything changed. The ruler of the past was no longer untouchable. The storm reached its peak, and then everything slowed. Not because the war was ending, but because something far greater was about to happen. Even the sky seemed to wait for the final moment. Zeus raised his hand, and the sky answered, not with one strike, but with everything it had. The force that followed was not just power, it was judgment, and for the first time, Cronus could not stand against it. The ruler of an entire era began to fall. Not quickly, not suddenly, but inevitably. The world felt the shift, as if something ancient was finally breaking apart. And then it was over. The Titan who once ruled everything was no longer above anyone. The war had ended, but something else had just begun, because power never disappears. It only changes hands, and now it belonged to him. At first, he was seen as a savior, the one who ended fear, the one who brought change. But power has a way of changing everything. Even those who once fought against it, slowly, quietly, something began to shift, not in the world, but inside him. The same power that once freed him was now shaping him, and the line between protector and ruler began to disappear. Because once you control everything, you stop asking if you should. And that is where everything changes. The hero of the war was becoming something else. Not a savior, but a god who would never be questioned. At first, no one questioned him. Why would they? He had ended the old world and built something new, something stronger, something under his control. But control is never enough. Once you have it, you begin to want more. Not because you need it, but because you can take it. And Zeus was no different. The same force that gave him power began to reshape him. He no longer ruled. He dominated. Every decision, every moment, everything moved through him. And with that came something dangerous. Not rebellion, not resistance, but silence. Because when no one speaks, power grows unchecked. And when power grows unchecked, it stops asking questions. It stops caring about consequences. It becomes something else, something absolute. And that is exactly what Zeus became. History remembers him as the king of gods, the ruler of the sky, the one who brought order. But history rarely tells the full story, because power always has a second side, one that most never see until it's too late. The same God who freed the world also made sure no one would ever challenge him again, not through fear alone, but through control, because true power is not in destroying your enemies, it's in making sure they never rise at all. And Zeus understood that better than anyone. He didn't just win the war, he rewrote the rules, and in doing so, he became something no prophecy had ever described. Not just a god, but a force that would never be replaced. And that is where the story truly changes. Because this was never just about a war. It was about power and what it does to those who hold it. The rise was inevitable. The victory was undeniable. But the cost was something else entirely. Because in the end, he didn't just defeat the past, he became its continuation. And that is the truth no one talks about. The God who broke the world also made sure it would always belong to him. And yet, even after everything, the world did not feel complete. It felt different, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, not broken, not destroyed, but changed. Because when a war like that ends, it does not simply disappear. It leaves something behind, in the ground, in the sky, in the silence, between every moment. And Zeus could feel it. Every step he took echoed differently. Every breath felt heavier. Not because of exhaustion, but because of what he had become. Because for the first time, there was no resistance left, no force standing against him, no voice strong enough to question him. And at first, that felt like victory. A world without conflict, a world without opposition, a world that finally made sense. But the longer it lasted, the more something felt wrong. Because conflict is not just destruction, it is balance. And without balance, power begins to expand, without direction. And Zeus began to feel that expansion, not as a thought, not as a decision, but as something instinctive, something natural, something inevitable. He no longer reacted to the world reacted to him. Storms did not come unless he allowed them to. Lightning did not strike unless he chose it. Even the sky seemed to wait for his permission. And when everything begins to wait for you, you stop waiting for anything else. Time itself starts to feel different, slower, heavier, less important, because nothing moves unless you move it. And that kind of power changes the way you see everything. At first, he told himself, it was necessary, that control was the only way to keep the world from falling apart again, that if he let go, even for a moment, everything would collapse, just like before. And maybe, for a time, that was true. But power does not stay logical. It does not stay balanced. It grows, it adapts, it reshapes the one who holds it. And slowly, the line between necessity and desire began to disappear. Because once you realize that nothing can stop you, you begin to wonder what else you can do. Not what you should do, but what you can do. And that question is where everything begins to change. Because can is far more dangerous than should. And Zeus started asking it more often. He reshaped storms, not because he needed to, but because he could. He moved clouds, not because it mattered, but because nothing stopped him. He watched the world below, not as something separate, but as something that belonged to him. And the longer he watched, the more distant it became, not physically, but emotionally. Because when you stand above everything, you stop feeling like part of it. You stop seeing individuals. You stop seeing stories. You stop seeing consequences. You begin to see patterns, movements, outcomes. And the world becomes something else. Not a place, but a system. Something to control. Something to adjust. Something to perfect. And that is when the change becomes complete. Not when power is gained, but when perspective is lost. Because once you lose perspective, there is nothing left to hold you back. And Zeus crossed that line, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones. Decisions that felt insignificant, actions that felt justified, choices that no one questioned. Because again, who would? Who would rise against the one who had already defeated everything? And so, no one did. And that silence grew deeper, stronger, more permanent, until it became the new order of the world. A world where nothing opposed him. A world where nothing challenged him. A world where nothing could stop him. And that is when power becomes something else entirely. Not strength, not control, but inevitability. Because when nothing can stop something, it stops needing a reason. And Zeus no longer needed one. The storms continued. The sky obeyed. The world remained exactly as he allowed it to be. But deep beneath it all, something else had already begun. Something quiet, something unnoticed, something familiar. Because history does not simply repeat, it evolves. And every force, no matter how powerful, creates the conditions for the next one, the next rise, the next shift, the next story. And somewhere, far from the sky, far from the throne, far from the reach of lightning, something was already growing, just like he once did, hidden, ignored, unseen. And that is the truth that no ruler can escape, not even Zeus, because no matter how absolute your power becomes, no matter how complete your control feels, there is always something beyond it, something waiting, something preparing, something that comes next. And when it does, it will not ask for permission. It will not wait. It will not hesitate, just like he didn't. And when that moment comes, the cycle begins again. A new force, a new rise, a new challenge, and a new story that will one day be told, just like this one. And the more he asked, the easier it became to answer. Because when nothing resists you, every action feels justified, every choice feels correct, every decision feels inevitable. And that is how it begins. Not with destruction, not with chaos, but with certainty. A quiet, unshakable certainty that everything you do is exactly how it should be. And Zeus felt that certainty settle inside him, like something final, like something that no longer needed to be questioned. He no longer paused. He no longer hesitated. He no longer wondered what would happen if he chose differently, because to him, there was no different anymore. There was only one path, his. And when there is only one path, there is no room for doubt. The world below continued to move. Seasons changed, winds shifted, clouds formed and disappeared. But all of it felt smaller, less important, less real. Because when you stand above everything, you begin to lose what it feels like to be within it. You stop feeling connected. You stop feeling present. You stop feeling human. And even though Zeus was never human, he understood what that meant once, long ago, before the war, before the storm, before the silence. But now, that memory felt distant, faded, like something that belonged to someone else. And in its place, something else had grown, something colder, something sharper, something more precise. Because power does not just elevate you, it isolates you, it separates you from everything you once understood. And the higher you rise, the fewer things remain that can reach you, until eventually, nothing does. And that is where the real change happens. Not when you gain power, but when you become untouchable. Because when nothing can reach you, nothing can remind you of what you were before. And Zeus had reached that point, completely. There were no equals, no rivals, no voices that could stand beside his and challenge it. And without that, something important disappears. Perspective. Because perspective comes from contrast, from difference, from resistance. And when all of that is gone, there is nothing left to reflect against. So you stop reflecting, you stop questioning, you stop seeing anything beyond your own will. And slowly, that will becomes everything. Not just your actions, not just your decisions, but reality itself. Because when your power reaches far enough, your will becomes the shape of the world. And Zeus began to shape it without even realizing it. Storms came faster, lightning struck harder, the sky grew heavier, darker, more intense. Not because it needed to, but because he felt it should. And when a god feels something should be, it becomes reality. That is the difference. That is the danger. Because at that point, there is no separation between thought and consequence. Everything becomes immediate. Everything becomes real. Everything becomes final. And yet, even in that absolute state, something remained. Something small, something quiet, something almost forgotten. A memory, not of power, not of victory, but of before, of a time when he was not above everything, when he had to rise, when he had to fight, when he had to struggle. And for a brief moment, that memory broke through. Not strong, not overwhelming, but present. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the world, but inside him. A question, small, faint, but real. What if this was not the end? What if this was only another beginning? Because if he could rise, if he could challenge, if he could take power, then why couldn't someone else? Why couldn't something else be forming right now, somewhere beyond his reach? And that thought, for the first time in a long time, did not feel impossible. It felt inevitable, because that is the nature of power. It creates opposition, even when none exists, even when everything is silent, even when the world appears completely under control. Something always begins to grow, slowly, quietly, unnoticed, until one day it isn't. And Zeus understood that, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel it, like a distant storm, far beyond the horizon, not visible yet, but already forming, already building, already coming. And for the first time since the war ended, his silence felt different, not empty, not controlled, but waiting for what comes next. Because no matter how powerful you become, no matter how absolute your control feels, there is always something beyond it, something that does not belong to you, something you cannot shake, something you cannot stop. And when that something rises, it will not ask who you are. It will not care what you've done. It will not remember the world you built. It will only do what every force before it has done. It will rise. It will challenge. It will change everything. And when that moment comes, even Zeus will not stand outside of it, because no power, no matter how great, exists forever. It only feels that way until it doesn't. And that is the truth behind every god, every ruler, every force that ever believed it was untouchable. And still, even with that thought, he did not move, he did not act, because some things cannot be rushed. Some things must reveal themselves in time. And time was something Zeus now had in abundance, or at least it felt that way. Because when nothing challenges you, time stops feeling like a force and starts feeling like a resource, something that belongs to you, something you control. But time has never belonged to anyone, not to kings, not to gods, not even to Zeus. And that was something he had not yet fully understood. Because when you stand at the top, everything below you feels temporary. Everything feels replaceable. Everything feels predictable. But what lies beyond is never predictable. And that is where every story finds its turning point. Not at the moment of victory, but in the moment after, when nothing seems to threaten it anymore. Because that is when the real test begins, not of strength, not of power, but of awareness, of understanding, of whether you can see what is coming before it arrives. And Zeus, for all his power, was still learning that, still discovering that control is not the same as certainty, because you can control everything around you and still not see what is forming beyond it. And that is what makes power fragile, not because it is weak, but because it is limited to what it can see. And beyond that limit, there is always something more, something unseen, something unknown, something inevitable. The sky remained under his command. The storm still answered him. The world still moved as he allowed it to. But somewhere beyond all of that, something had already begun. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly. The same way everything begins. The same way he once began. And that is what made it dangerous. Because the most powerful forces are not the ones you see coming. They are the ones that grow while no one is looking. And Zeus knew that better than anyone, even if he didn't fully admit it. Because deep down, beneath the storm, beneath the power, beneath the silence, there was still something human in the way he understood the world. Not human in form, not human in weakness, but human in one very specific way. He remembered what it felt like to rise, to be unseen, to be underestimated, to grow while no one was watching. And that memory, no matter how distant, never truly disappears. It stays, hidden, waiting, and sometimes it returns, not as fear, not as doubt, but as awareness. The kind that doesn't stop you, but makes you look just a little bit further, just a little bit deeper, just enough to realize that even now, even at the peak of everything, the story is not finished, because it never is. There is always another chapter, another rise, another fall, another force waiting to take its place. And when that moment comes, it will not announce itself. It will not ask for permission. It will not wait for the world to be ready. It will simply begin, just like he did, just like everything does. And when it does, everything will change again, not slowly, not quietly, but completely. And that is the part of the story that no one ever tells, not because it is hidden, not because it is secret, but because it has not happened yet. And yet, it always does. Because no matter how powerful a god becomes, no matter how absolute his rule feels, no matter how complete his control appears, nothing ever truly stays at the top forever. And somewhere, beyond the storm, beyond the sky, beyond the reach of lightning, something is already beginning. Again